Yeah. On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 45, and one senator responded present. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative, the motion is not agreed to. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume legislative session and the motion to proceed to S. 1944, which the clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to consider calendar number 251 as 1944, a bill to create jobs by providing payroll tax relief for middle-class families and businesses and for other purposes.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent to enter into a colloquy with my Republican colleagues for up to 30 minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I stand today to urge my colleagues to support efforts to bring forward a balanced budget amendment, one that can be passed out of both houses of Congress and submitted to the states for ratification. Article 5 of the Constitution gives us the power to change the Constitution from time to time, to modify our law of laws, that 224-year-old document that has fostered the development of the greatest civilization the world has ever known. We've done this 27 times. We've done it at times when, in order to protect and preserve the nation that our ancestors fought so valiantly to create and later again to defend, we have to modify our government, the manner in which we do business, in order to preserve that system, in order to make it strong, in order to ensure that it will continue to be strong for future generations. We made it stronger when, for example, we added the Bill of Rights shortly after the ratification of the Constitution. We made it stronger again when, for example, we added the so-called Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, ending slavery and the badges and incidents thereof. We made it stronger when we made clear that women must always be given the right to vote. We've made it stronger a number of times, and the time to make it stronger has come yet again. It's time to modify the Constitution to limit, to restrict Congress's current power granted by Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2 of the Constitution to borrow money on credit of the United States. The reason we need to do this is because this power has been so severely abused over such a prolonged period of time that it's causing devastating consequences for our economy and for our ability to fund the operations of government. We've now accumulated over $15 trillion in debt as a country. That works out to about $50,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. It works out arguably to about $120,000 to $150,000 for every taxpayer in America. This is a lot of money. It also represents about 90%, between 90 and 100% of our gross domestic product annually, depending on whose statistics you follow. This is troubling, given that there is an abundant amount of research indicating that once a country's sovereign debt to GDP ratio crosses the significant 90% threshold, which we have now done, economic growth tends to slow to a point that an economy as large as ours can expect to lose as many as 1 million jobs a year. We can't afford to lose jobs, especially when we know what one of the major causes is, our national debt. It's time that we change the way we do business. It's time to change the manner in which Congress acquires new debt. This is no longer an issue that is either Republican or Democratic, that's either liberal or conservative. It is simply American. Because I remind my colleagues that whether you're most concerned on the one hand about preserving America's leading edge, its ability to fund its national defense program, or on the other hand, if you're most concerned about funding our entitlement programs, you should want a balanced budget amendment because this is what we need to do. This is what we have to do in order to protect our ability to fund both of those things and everything else that we do. You see, because by the end of this decade, according to the White House's own numbers, We'll be paying close to $1 trillion every year just to pay the interest on our national debt, just the interest alone. We're currently spending a little over $200 billion a year on interest. Still a lot of money, but about $800 billion lower than what we're likely to be spending by the end of this decade. Where will that additional $800 billion every single year come from? This isn't a discretionary sum. This is money that we have to pay. It's the first thing that we have to pay. Where will that $800 billion difference be made up? At that point, we can't expect simply to raise taxes to make up that difference. I'm not aware of any tax increase plan that could bring in that much additional revenue every year without stagnating our economy to the point that we might, within a year or two, bring in less revenue rather than more. Certainly not $800 billion more. Nor am I aware of any plan whereby we could simply borrow an additional $800 billion just to pay that interest. Because doing so, of course, would cause our interest rates to skyrocket, grow out of control, and our interest payments would be even more significant at that point, thus further impairing our ability to fund everything from defense to entitlements. So at that point, the only option on the table would be dramatic, severe, abrupt, even draconian cuts to everything from defense to entitlements and everything in between. We don't want this. There is a better way. And the better way forward consists of a severe, permanent, structural spending reform that can be achieved only through a balanced budget amendment. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. And more importantly, let me explain what I don't mean by that. We have to beware of things that masquerade as balanced budget amendments, things that will actually do the job instead of purporting to do the job, distracting the public's attention away from the need to do this, while in effect doing nothing. We need to be aware of what I sometimes call the Trojan horse balanced budget amendment proposal. So there are a few hallmarks of what a real effective balanced budget amendment would accomplish. First and foremost, it has to apply to all spending in requiring Congress to provide a supermajority vote for any borrowing authority. There are some that have suggested that we should have a balanced budget amendment that exempts certain categories of entitlement spending. But of course, as we all know, it's entitlement spending that it continues to consume a larger and larger share of our national budget each and every year. It's entitlement spending that is anticipated to have shortfalls for sums that will have to be expended for people, Americans alive today, could range anywhere from 50 or 60 to 110 trillion dollars in unfunded entitlement liabilities. So simply exempting out entire categories of entitlements is one of these hallmarks of a Trojan horse balanced budget amendment. We can't do that. We need it to apply to all federal outlays, all federal spending. Second, an effective balanced budget amendment must cap spending at the average historical level of federal revenue. So over the last 40 years, our average average income as a percentage of GDP has been about 18 to 18.5% of our gross domestic product. So we need to make sure that we're not spending more than that Congress can't, without a supermajority vote, spend more than 18% of GDP in any given year. Otherwise, we run the risk that Congress will find a way through tricky accounting schemes to circumvent the restrictions to make sure that it's not spending more than it takes in. Third, the supermajority requirement must apply to the votes in both houses of Congress every single time Congress wants to spend more than it takes in. Any balanced budget amendment proposal that allows for a simple majority to bring about an exception to these spending limitations is one that Congress can and will use to circumvent the amendment entirely. Let me explain what I mean. We've had in the past certain statutory legislative limitations on Congress's spending and borrowing power. Some of these have been known as the Graham-Rudman-Hollings legislation, also the PAYGO rules. But because Congress makes those laws and because they haven't been reduced to a constitutional amendment, just as Congress giveth, Congress taketh away. And Congress has seen fit to exempt itself out of those rules. A balanced budget amendment, even while enshrined in our Constitution, becomes no more effective than those statutory or internal rules unless every time Congress wants to get around those limitations, Congress is required to cast a supermajority vote to justify that excess. Finally, an effective balanced budget amendment must require that Congress cast a supermajority vote any time we raise the debt limit. This will give us an additional guarantee that tricky accounting mechanisms won't be used to circumvent some of these most important restrictions. Without these restrictions, Mr. President, Congress will continue to spend out of control because members of Congress tend to be rewarded when they spend, and they tend to be criticized when they cut. And political pressures are such that I fear this spending will continue out of control in perpetuity until that moment at which we reach our natural mathematical borrowing limit, not our statutory debt limit, our natural mathematical borrowing limit. It's at that point, Mr. President, when the most abrupt, the most painful, the most draconian cuts will have to be made. We can do this in a way that makes sense. We can do this in a way that's sensitive to the needs of the most vulnerable Americans, those that have become the most dependent upon our entitlement state, those that have become dependent for their day-to-day existence on these very programs. Those programs will have to be cut abruptly and in the most painful manner unless we take the necessary steps right now. Start moving on to a smooth glide path toward a balanced budget amendment. We may not be able to balance our budget overnight, but we can do it over the course of a few years, and that's exactly what this would allow us to do. I've worked closely with a number of my Republican colleagues in supporting Senate Joint Resolution 10, a balanced budget amendment proposal that has the support of all 47 Republicans. One of my close allies in this endeavor has been my friend and colleague, the junior senator from Kentucky. I'd like to ask him to share his perspective on why this is necessary. And so I asked Senator Paul, why do you think this is so important for us to have this amendment right now?
Well, I think Congress has failed. You know, we haven't passed a budget up here in 2 years, much less a balanced budget. So we can't even pass a budget under the normal procedures, and we're showing no signs of being able to balance our own budget. They say that the American public, when you ask them, are you for a balanced budget, 70 to 75% of the people are for it, Republicans, Democrats, and independents. Now, Congress currently has about a 10% approval rating. My thought is maybe our approval rating is so low because we're not listening to what the people want. The people want us to balance our budget. They want us to do the responsible thing. But they also don't want to say, oh, Social Security, we're going to put that off to the side. They want the Social Security fund to be sound, too. What are we doing right now? We're reducing the funding to Social Security. We're doing exactly the things that we shouldn't be doing up here. So I think it is important, as you said, that the balanced budget needs to include all of spending, and we need to balance our budget.
If the Congress, which consists of a Senate and the House, and if members of the Senate and the House are elected representatives of the people who stand for re-election at regular intervals, and if the American voting public overwhelmingly supports a balanced budget amendment, why then haven't we passed it and given the states the opportunity to ratify an amendment like this?
Well, you know, the big driving force up here is entitlements. The interesting thing is, if you look at the revenue coming into government, it's all being spent on entitlements and interest. 40% of every dollar is being borrowed, but that means we're having to borrow all the money for national defense, for our roads, for all the rest of government. 40% of every dollar, $40,000 a second is being borrowed. Why don't we come to an agreement? I've been asking many people on the other side that, and they say, well, we will not fix entitlements until we have a $1 trillion tax increase. Well, if that's the starting point, we're never going to fix entitlements because many of us think raising taxes is a mistake in the middle of a recession, and we think the more money left in the private sector would be better for jobs. So we have this balanced budget debate, but we also, as part of that, have to figure out how to reduce spending, and that's in the entitlement programs because they consume 60% of the budget. But there's this unwillingness up here, and I think people would like us to find solutions. When I go home to my state, doesn't matter whether they're a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent, they want us to fix the entitlement programs, but they don't want it to be dependent on increasing taxes on everyone also.
What's your sense as to how the various state legislatures are likely to respond to a constitutional amendment proposed by both houses of Congress? You think they'd likely ratify such an amendment by the necessary 3/4 margin?
In the last year, I went and spoke before my state legislature to a joint session of the House and Senate, and there was overwhelming support for a balanced budget amendment. And in fact, I think there's actually a movement out there to do it if we don't do it. There's so much feeling among the public that this enormous debt is hurting us. You know, when I go home and I talk to people, I say, look, the debt, the people that the debt hurts the worst are those on fixed income, senior citizens, and those in the working class. Those are the people being hurt by this debt because it causes rising prices as we print the new money. Those people are hurt every time they go buy gas at the pump, every time they go to the grocery store. So the rising prices are really hurting senior citizens and the working class. The only way we're going to fix it is to have rules that must be obeyed.
So they're paying for Washington's fiscal irresponsibility in the form of job losses, in the form of increased prices for goods and for services, and in the form of inflation. It's likewise my experience with my state legislature that they seem to be very supportive of it. In fact, I have a document here signed by the legislative leaders of my state, by Governor Gary Herbert, by Utah House of Representatives Speaker Rebecca Lockhart, and by Utah State Senate President Michael Waddups. It concludes essentially as follows. They say, quote, "We urge the United States Senate and House of Representatives to pass a balanced budget amendment and send it to the states for ratification. Additionally, we urge Congress to make Utah's concurrent resolution part of the congressional record." They also proceed to explain why they feel so strongly about this. They say, "Not only for our own sake, but for future generations as well, the states must now combine in an unwavering resolve with convincing action to put the nation's financial house in order. Passage of your own state's resolution urging the support for a balanced budget amendment can help make this happen. Please join with Utah and call upon Congress immediately to pass a balanced budget amendment. We respectfully encourage you and urge your congressional delegation to act in your behalf." So they're calling not only on Congress but also on their fellow state legislators throughout the country to urge the same action from Congress. And in the same breath, they also adopted and they supported wholeheartedly the specific balanced budget amendment proposal that is found in Senate Joint Resolution 10. I thank them for doing that, and I think they reflect views of so many of our state legislatures, which balance their budgets every single year. Most of them do. And it's not news when they do it. It's not news because it's what's expected. It's what's expected because that's what they do. I look forward to the day and age when it's no longer news, when Congress balances its budget. Senator Paul, I'd like to ask you another question. Why is it that so many are fond of saying, as our president has recently said, we don't need a balanced budget amendment. What we need is for Congress to just do its job. Why isn't that enough to carry the day?
The problem is in the past we have had rules, as you mentioned, Graham-Rudman-Hollings, pay-as-you-go. I think pay-as-you-go, when it was passed in the late 1990s, was broken 700 times. There doesn't seem to be the spine or the willpower to say no up here. Everybody wants something from government, but they don't realize that by getting things from government that we don't pay for, that the debt has ramifications. You know, Admiral Mullins said last year the biggest threat to our national security right now is our debt. Erskine Bowles, who is the head of the Debt Commission, said that the most predictable crisis in our history that's coming is going to be a debt crisis. So for those who will oppose a balanced budget on the other side, they will need to explain to the American people when chaotic situations come and we're having trouble paying for those things that come from government, when the value of the money is destroyed and when prices are rising dramatically, they will have to explain to the American people why they thought it wasn't necessary to balance the budget. And I've seen no willpower to attack entitlements. I've seen no will. There are simple ways. We could gradually raise the age of the entitlement eligibility and means test the benefits. We could fix Social Security tomorrow. We could fix Medicare tomorrow. But the other side is unwilling to talk about entitlement reform unless they feel like they are owed some obligation of raising taxes by $1 trillion. That would be a disaster for the economy. And it's beyond me why the other side will not say, let's fix Social Security. What would it take to fix Social Security? What would it take to fix Medicare? I think we could fix all of these problems, but I don't think the dialogue is there. I've been trying to ask questions to the other side for months now, and we aren't getting anywhere.
I think most members of Congress would acknowledge that their constituents want the federal budget balanced. Why isn't it enough for us just to tell members of Congress, please balance it? We don't want to have to restrict your authority. We don't want to have to take the keys away from the irresponsible driver. We just want you to be responsible. Why doesn't that work?
I think it's because so much of government spending is considered to be mandatory, and so it just keeps enlarging and expanding. And also because people have, great big hearts and they want to help everyone, but they don't realize the ramifications of accumulating such a massive debt. As you accumulate this debt, there are ramifications. There are higher prices. There's also the threat of an economic collapse. There's the threat of an entire country. Greece is going under. Italy is behind them. Portugal, Spain, they're struggling under this burden of debt. And they say when a country's debt equals its economy, when a country's debt is about 100% of its gross domestic product, that you're losing 1 million jobs a year. Our debt is stealing American jobs. It's making us weaker as a country. It's making us vulnerable. It's making our national security vulnerable. But we have to do something, and there's no evidence. We can't even in this body pass a budget, much less a balanced budget. So I think everything about this body shows a failure to be fiscally responsible and that we need stronger rules.
Perhaps it is inherent in the institution itself, in the forces at play, that have made Congress uniquely vulnerable to this kind of massive deficit spending. But whatever the reason, we know that Congress isn't willing, isn't able, or at least in recent years has not been inclined, except in rare, unusual circumstances, to balance its own budget. That being the case, we can't assume that Congress will all of a sudden start doing its job, as those who have used this argument have insisted. Part of Congress's job, as Congress has come to perceive it, is to engage in deficit spending. One of Congress's powers, as members of Congress who read the Constitution will point out, is to borrow money on credit of the United States. And so it isn't enough simply to say, Congress, do your job, because it has regarded this kind of massive deficit as consistent with that mandate, consistent with that injunction. Meanwhile, Congress is continuing to occupy a larger and larger share of the American economy. We have to remember that for the first 150 years or so of our republic's existence, at the federal level, we were spending between 1% and 4% of gross domestic product at the federal national level, with only two brief exceptions, once during the Civil War and once during and in the immediate aftermath of World War I. But that all started to change in the 1930s, when we broke into double digits for the first time ever during peacetime. We've never really gone back, and now the federal government is spending about 25% of GDP annually. Roughly a quarter out of every dollar that moves through the American economy every year is taken out of the real economy by Washington. It's absorbed within the federal morass that is our government. That's a problem. That needs to change. I fear, I suspect, I firmly believe that it will not change until we take this power away, until we at least impose severe restrictions on Congress's borrowing power, because it has become part of Congress's nature to engage in this kind of out-of-control deficit spending. Senator Paul, I'd like to ask you another question. How do you think it would impact the lives of Americans, of Kentuckians, on a day-to-day basis if we were to pass an amendment like this and have it ratified by the states?
You know, the People maintain that they're for jobs, they're for getting the economy growing again. If we were to pass a balanced budget amendment and send it to the states this year, it would create more jobs and create a better psychology than we've had in this country in decades. I think you would see a rise in the stock market like you've never seen before if we said to Wall Street and we said to investors worldwide, we are going to balance our budget. We are not going to spend more than we take in. I think you'd see an economic recovery begin like you've never seen in this country, and I think you'd see millions of jobs created. That's why we have to do this. The American people want it. And what amazes me about this debate is we're going to have this debate and have this vote, and the vast majority of the other side has said they will not vote for a balanced budget amendment. So I say take that home. Tell your people at home that you are opposed to balancing the budget, and let's run on that, and let's see who wins the elections in the future, because our country's future depends on this, on balancing our budget and controlling the debt, and I hope that we don't wake up when it's too late.
I couldn't agree more with that assessment, and I think it's important for us to remind our colleagues that because the American people overwhelmingly support this, by a margin of about 75%, according to a recent CNN poll, those who oppose it, those who are members of this body, who are of our sister body, the U.S. House of Representatives, just down the hall, who choose not to support it, will do so, will cast their no vote at their own political peril, because the American people are standing up and they are demanding more. They understand that, in the words of Benjamin Franklin, he'll cheat without scruple who can without fear. When Congress is free to spend more than it takes in every single year without political consequence, bad things happen. Congress starts to manipulate more and more of the economy. And that is something that the American people understand is hurtful rather than helpful to them, to the people on the ground, to the person who's unemployed and looking for a job, for the person who's underemployed or underpaid for the work that he does, for the single mother who's just worried about taking care of her children, for the grandparents who are worried about the future of their grandchildren, worried about the fact that for the first time in American history, Americans fear that their posterity will enjoy a lower standard of living than what they have enjoyed. All of this is due to the fact that Congress has known no real boundaries to its authority and recognized no real limits on its ability to spend your hard-earned money. This has real consequences, but we can forestall those negative consequences right now if we will act to restrict on a permanent and structural basis Congress's ability to engage in deficit spending. Accept no imitations. Beware of the Trojan horse balanced budget amendment, the one that can be circumvented easily by a simple majority vote. Beware of the balanced budget amendment that doesn't limit as a percentage of GDP Congress's ability to spend money. We look out for these principles. We get this balanced budget amendment passed, submit it to the states for ratification. They will ratify it, and we will find that our best days as Americans are yet ahead of us. I urge my colleagues to cast a vote in favor of Senate Joint Resolution 10. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
The senior senator from Iowa is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Supreme Court in a few months will be addressing 4 issues in connection with the constitutionality of the Obama health care law. Previously, I spoke about the unconstitutionality of the individual mandate. Today, I want to discuss the second issue of 4 issues. How much of the law must be struck down if the court finds the individual mandate to be unconstitutional? This legal question is called severability. When a court rules that a law is unconstitutional, it can strike down only those parts that it considers unconstitutional. It can strike down the parts that are intertwined with the unconstitutional provision, or it can strike down the whole law. Its action will depend upon whether the remainder of the law can function as Congress intended when it passed it. There are rules governing severability. Normally, when only parts of a law are held to be unconstitutional, only those parts of the law are struck down by the court. But when a statute's unconstitutional provisions are severed, the whole law falls when Congress would not have passed the constitutional provisions without the unconstitutional ones being in it as well. It is not enough that some of the remaining provisions are constitutional. The Supreme Court has asked whether the remaining provisions, quote, would function in a manner consistent with the original legislative bargain, end of quote. The lower courts have reached 4 different conclusions concerning the health care reform law. First, that the individual mandate can be severed from the rest of the bill. Second, that the individual mandate can be severed, but only if the law's related provisions that require mandatory issue and community ratings are also severed. Third, the opposite position, that the mandate and the related provisions are not severable. And finally, that the mandate is not severable and that the whole law must fall. One of my Judiciary Committee colleagues has stated that for the Democrats, quote, worst case scenario, the mandate falls, end of quote. But even the Obama administration does not take that view. The administration argues that if the mandate falls, the guaranteed issue and community rating provisions must also be struck down. The President's administration says health insurance markets will not function if all Americans are not forced to buy health insurance. And insurance companies must nonetheless insure everyone who seeks coverage at prices that do not reflect their health risk. Mr. President, if the mandate falls, keeping any of this law would violate the original legislative bargain. And I would like to remind my colleagues of that original legislative bargain. The health care law passed because the majority party, in its own partisan way, was going to pass this bill by any means necessary. And the individual mandate was very critical to the ability to pass this law and to particularly pass it only by partisan considerations. We considered an amendment in the Finance Committee that would have granted exemptions from the individual mandate to everybody who asked for that exemption. My good friend, the chairman, and that's Senator Baucus, as we all know, correctly stated, quote, the system won't work if this amendment passes. He further called it, quote, an amendment which guts and kills health reform, end of quote. He commented that, quote, if we're serious about making sure that the Americans have health insurance, we all have to participate, end of quote. So, the bill's sponsors knew the whole operation of the law depended upon this very important provision that the court's now considering, whether on the individual mandate and whether or not that issue is constitutional. So, let me repeat that. The people promoting this legislation that passed on a partisan vote knew that the whole operation of the law depended upon the compulsion of the individual mandate. The legislative bargain also showed that this law would not have passed if a single comma had been changed. Congress could not have enacted any part of this law without the individual mandate or any other provision. And that situation comes about from the fact that the bill passed the Senate by one vote, and individual senators were able to extract specific provisions that benefited their state in return for agreeing to provide their deciding vote for the bill. And I think we all know the outrage that came from the grassroots of America over some of those very special provisions. And we also know that the American people were disgusted by these deals. But without those arrangements and deals, none of the law would have passed. Those deals were one of the reasons why the Democrats lost their 60-vote majority in the last election. So when the other body could pass a bill only by accepting the Senate bill, they blocked any amendments that would have changed so much as a comma. Had anything changed, the new 59-vote Senate majority would have prevented passage. The bill was offered on a take-it-or-leave-it basis, an all or nothing. If the individual mandate is struck down, then the whole law must fall. And although it is not conclusive, it is certainly relevant that the law does not contain a severability clause. This is one more indication that Congress thought that the law was a unified whole. It is simply not reasonable to argue that the law should survive without the mandate. The most important political accomplishment of the law is the additional coverage. It is not certainly the lower costs that we were promised. Without the mandate, coverage under the law evaporates. Does anyone really believe that without the coverage in the law, Congress could have passed the massive Medicaid expansion? Does anyone really believe that without the coverage in the law, Congress could have passed the draconian cuts in Medicare? Does anyone really believe that without the coverage in the law, Congress could have passed hundreds of billions of dollars in new taxes? Of course not. It is simply not a legitimate argument that the rest of the bill could have ever stood on its own without the individual mandate enabling additional coverage. So, I am pleased that the Supreme Court has granted oral arguments devoted on the severability question all by itself. In the past, the Supreme Court has issued very activist severability rulings in which it rewrote a statute in a way that Congress never would have passed it. For instance, it completely rewrote the campaign finance laws in the 1976 Buckley versus Vallejo decision in a way that produced an unworkable system that no member of Congress would have ever voted for. And in the Booker case, the Supreme Court rewrote the sentencing laws in a way that produced a very unworkable system that no member of Congress would have voted for. This time, the Supreme Court should not use severability doctrine to rewrite the health care law into something that Congress never would have passed in the first place. It should strike down the entirety of the law in keeping with the law on this subject. Such a ruling would give us the chance to do what we did not do before, work in a truly bipartisan way to address these issues. I yield the floor.
Mr. President. Majority Leader is recognized.
I'm saddened to have learned this morning that 5 people were killed late yesterday in a terrible helicopter crash just a few miles outside Las Vegas. My sympathies are with the families of those who died, including pilot Landon Neal and 4 passengers. My thoughts are with them as recovery efforts continue this morning as they lay their lost loved ones to rest. Reports indicate the aircraft was on a tour of Hoover Dam It crashed in a remote and rocky terrain in the River Mountains between Lake Mead and Henderson, Nevada, just a few miles from Las Vegas. Mr. President, I've taken those helicopter tours. It's an exciting trip. I mean, people don't realize this, we're just a few miles from Grand Canyon there in Las Vegas. It takes just a short time to get there and travel up that beautiful canyon to see where millions of people go every year to see Grand Canyon. Hundreds of thousands come from Las Vegas to see it. I'm truly grateful for the efforts of the Park Service Rangers, Metropolitan Police Department Search and Rescue Team, and the Clark County and Henderson Fire Departments responded rapidly to the scene of the accident. The Federal Aviation Administration and the National Transportation Safety Board are investigating this accident as we speak. I'll continue to monitor the investigation as well as recovery efforts as they progress. Hundreds of thousands of tourists, I repeat, enjoy these helicopter tours each year. I'm sorry that innocent people have lost their lives in such a rare tragedy. Nevada puts great stock in protecting the safety of its tourists, whether they're flying to the Grand Canyon or walking down the Las Vegas Strip. I hope the inquiry into the causes of this crash will help us better protect helicopter passengers and pilots in the future. And again, my heart goes out to the families as they mourn this awful tragedy. Note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senior senator from Iowa is
I ask
recognized.
that the calling of the quorum be dispensed.
Without objection, so ordered.
If the Democrats aren't going to take their time, I'd like to take 5 or 6 minutes for remarks on another subject. I ask unanimously.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. I come to the floor today to commend Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta for personally focusing top-level attention to what's been a festering problem, and I think it's fair for me to say a festering problem of decades. I'm talking about the Defense Department's broken accounting system and lack of financial accountability. Secretary Panetta has grabbed the bull by the horns and told the military services to get on the stick and move out smartly. He wants them to fix the problem now, not later. Secretary Panetta's bold initiative is laid out in a department-wide memorandum dated October 11th this year. In this document, he calls for an all-hands-on-deck priority effort to accelerate plans to create a modern, fully integrated finance and accounting system. Such a system, if it ever comes to be, would be designed to generate reliable, accurate, and complete financial information. Such a system could be capable of producing credible financial statements that can earn clean opinions from independent auditors. If that happens, the department will achieve what is called full audit readiness. But now I want to warn Secretary Panetta, things that happen to so many well-intentioned secretaries of defense, that could be a big if. Under the Chief Financial Officers Act of 1990, all government agencies were supposed to reach full audit readiness 15 years ago. As I understand it, the Defense Department is now the only delinquent agency. After the passage of so much time, how is it then that the Pentagon cannot provide an accurate accounting of all the money it spends? Doing it is a constitutional responsibility. Not doing it is unacceptable. Why are the military services dragging their feet like they have? What is the problem? Are all of the petty fiefdoms entrenched in Pentagon bureaucracy causing the problem? Is it because they do not want to surrender control of the money to a centralized financial authority? This is a festering problem Secretary Panetta has tackled. As a former chairman of the House Budget Committee and director of the Office of Management and Budget, he has the necessary knowledge and the necessary experience to get this job done. The magic date for achieving full audit readiness at Defense was set in concrete 2 years ago. Unfortunately, this goal has a long and elusive history. And that long and elusive history is best characterized by relentless slippage. It's a rolling target date, and most experts believe that the 2017 deadline is unattainable. Now, I'm sure our taxpaying public doesn't understand why the federal government wouldn't have the best accounting system in the world, but they don't, particularly in the Defense Department. Under Secretary Panetta's leadership, I hope all the slippage comes to a screeching halt and all the bureaucratic roadblocks are torn down. He has definitely turned up the heat and turned up the pressure. He has drawn a line in the sand. He wants to see results and see results now. He is calling for a revised plan for achieving audit readiness. It's due on his desk December 13th. So Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, everybody else, well, the Coast Guard's not involved, but everybody else, get on the stick because that's next week. He has set a near-term goal. He wants the Department to produce partial financial statements by 2014. As a first step, Secretary Panetta has called for production of statements of budgetary resources by 2014. A statement of budgetary resources is just one component of a financial statement, but it represents a big, important chunk of the whole. If credible statements of budgetary resources can be produced 3 years ahead of schedule, then maybe the full audit readiness by 2017 is indeed possible. I also understand that Secretary Panetta's near-term goal is being incorporated in legislation working its way through Congress right now. That should help to move the ball further down the field. Secretary Panetta's decision to set a preliminary goal of 2014 will be a good gauge, a good test of what is and is not possible. Can the Defense Department achieve full audit readiness by 2017? We won't have to wait 6 years to find that out under the process Secretary Panetta's instituted. If problems surface early on, we in Congress can help the Department take corrective action to keep this effort on track and moving in the right direction. A willingness and a commitment on the part of the Secretary of Defense to take on this problem goes way beyond the production of credible financial statements required by the Chief Financial Officers Act of the late 70s. It goes right to the heart of a much larger constitutional issue, and that is whether or not the Department of Defense is going to be held accountable. The Department must be able to provide a full and accurate accounting of all the money it spends. Under Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, such an accounting must be published from time to time. The taxpayers expect and deserve nothing less than that. Today, DOD can't do that. The status quo is unacceptable. While I began conducting oversight of the Defense Department financial management issues more than 20 years ago, I did not come to fully appreciate the true understanding of the root cause issue until 3 years ago. After receiving a series of anonymous letters alleging misconduct and mismanagement within the Inspector General's audit office, I initiated an in-depth oversight review of audit reporting. Early on in the review, there was a startling revelation. One all-important central element was adversely affecting every facet of the Inspector General's audit effort, and that was the department's broken accounting system. This dysfunctional system is driving the audit freight train. The success or failure of an audit turns on the quality of the financial data available, that data being available for audit by competent examiners. And the record clearly shows that the quality of financial data presented for audit by the department should be rated poor, or maybe I ought to say even worse than poor. Now, this is what I call the no audit trail scenario. It is frequently encountered by auditors trying to examine Department of Defense books of account. And that is the exact problem that Secretary Panetta is attempting to address. All my audit oversight work tells me that fixing the accounting machinery is the first step to audit readiness. Once a modern, fully integrated system is up and running, it should be a simple matter of punching the right computer buttons and credible financial statements will roll off of the printer. Doing routine oversight audits should be a piece of cake. Today's labor-intensive and time-consuming audit trail reconstruction work, which auditors now endure in the absence of reliable accounting records, will be a thing of the past. And most importantly, effective internal controls will be in place to protect the taxpayers' money against fraud, theft, and waste. What I am saying to my colleagues is this: Secretary Panetta is on the right track. He is trying to take us to a place where we need to go, and go soon. And I want to help him lead us there. So I'm here today to encourage and support this courageous effort to clean up the books. I admire and respect his personal commitment to such a noble cause. I'm also here to reinforce the work of encouragement contained in a letter my friend from Oklahoma, Dr. Coburn, and I penned to Secretary Panetta on November the 17th. We, meaning Senator Coburn and I, want to work with him to achieve this most worthy goal. And in the process of this remarks to the Senate, I hope other members of this Senate, particularly those that are on the Armed Services Committee, will also give Secretary Panetta encouraging words of support and thanks. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Assistant Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. President, on behalf of the leader, I ask unanimous consent the time until 2:30 p.m. be equally divided between the two leaders or their designees for debate on the Reid motion to proceed to calendar number 251 S-1944, that at 2:30 p.m. the Senate vote on the motion to proceed to S-1944, that upon disposition of the Reid motion to proceed, it be in order for the Republican leader or his designee to move to proceed to calendar number 244 S-1931, that there be 2 minutes debate equally divided between the two leaders or their designees prior to the vote, that both motions to proceed be subject to a 60 affirmative vote threshold. Finally, that the cloture motion relative to the motion to proceed to S-1944 be vitiated.
Is there objection? So ordered.
Mr. President, I have 10 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent these requests be agreed to and printed in the record.
Without objection. So ordered.
Mr. President, a little earlier today, the junior senator from Utah, Senator Lee, came to the floor to discuss the balanced budget amendment. Under the budget agreement agreed to in Congress, both the House and Senate were required to vote on a constitutional amendment to balance the budget before the end of this calendar year. The House has already taken the vote. The measure failed. But the Senate still has a responsibility to take it up, which we will do in the closing hours of the session this calendar year. There are at least 2 proposals before us for a constitutional amendment, and my committee, the Constitution Subcommittee of Judiciary, held a hearing last week asking questions about these approaches to the Constitution. The leading approach on the Republican side comes from both Senators Hatch and McConnell. I'm not certain which will offer or whether the language might change at the last minute, but it would enshrine in our Constitution a disciplinary mechanism to reduce the budget deficit. This has been brought before the Senate and House before. A particular approach requires that in each fiscal year, federal outlays shall not exceed receipts unless two-thirds of each House votes to waive. It caps the outlays at 18% of the gross domestic product each year unless two-thirds of each House votes to waive. Requires a two-third vote in each House for any tax or revenue measure. Requires a three-fifths vote in each House for raising the debt limit. Allows for waiver of the amendment in times of declared war or serious military conflict. Prohibits courts from ordering any increase in revenue to enforce the amendment. Directs Congress to enforce the amendment through appropriate legislation. Takes effect 5 years after ratification. This is far more extreme than the clean House balanced budget amendment, which failed to pass in that chamber on November 18th. The testimony before our subcommittee from experts in the field said that this amendment, proposed by Senators Hatch and McConnell, will require draconian cuts in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, our military retirement system, and many programs important to working families. It will make Republican fiscal policies the constitutional law of the land, giving protection to those in higher income categories from any tax increase forever, without an extraordinary vote in either House. It would delegate the task of resolving budget disputes to our court system. It would make recessions worse by requiring cuts in the countercyclical safety net programs like food stamps and unemployment, just at the time when those expenditures are most needed. It would increase the likelihood of debt limit standoffs each year and lead to increased burdens on our states. During the course of the hearing, several people came forward to testify. I'm going to ask consent that their statements be made part of the congressional record so my colleagues can have access to them. First was Robert Greenstein, president of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And Mr. Greenstein, who is well recognized and respected on Capitol Hill, spoke about the countercyclical aspect and said if you cut spending in the midst of a recession, you won't have the resources you need to provide unemployment, food stamps, and the things which save families when they're out of work or making very little money. I ask consent that Mr. Greenstein's statement be made part of the record.
Ordered.
And, Mr. President,